Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to our podcast. As you just heard from our CEO, Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, a librarian at the South Carolina Historical Society. Today, we're going to explore more of the order book of South Carolina's 4th Regiment, which detailed the daily activities of the men during the Revolutionary War. The last time we left them, it was January 1st, 1776. The men had just left their post on Fort Johnson and sailed across the harbor to return to the peninsula, which is Charleston proper. The skirmishes around Charleston seem to be increasing, and the troops have officially been authorized now by the state government. But before we get into the order book, let's talk about an upcoming event. Save the date for our fall tour, which will be Sunday, October 27th, and we'll be exploring the sites in and around Gaffney, including private homes, churches, and the Cowpens National Battlefield. So lots more Revolutionary War stuff on that tour and some other decades as well. Of course, to stay up to date on all of our events, including our Friday architectural tours of the museum, head to the News and Events tab at our website, schistory.org. And now let's go over our sources for today's episode. We are, of course, using the 4th Regiment Order Book housed at the South Carolina Historical Society. We're also using Carolina.com, the enrollment roster of Captain Grimke's company of the South Carolina Artillery Regiment, part of the Grimke family papers, housed at the College of Charleston's Special Collections Library, the Town of Mount Pleasant's website, the National Park Service's website, and the American Revolution Institute's website. And now let's head back to January 1776. As a reminder, the 4th Regiment are artillery focused, so their job is to manage the cannons and other artillery, often for the 2nd Regiment. They're stationed right now at this point in the order book near Gadsden's Wharf, and they're in rotation, serving as guard at Colonel Lawrence's Wharf. General Orders, 2nd January 1776, Parole, Mecklenburg. Regimental Orders. George Nixon, Gentleman, is appointed adjutant to the Regiment of the Artillery and must be obeyed as such. Every officer having a servant of his own to wait on him and not taking a man from the regiment for that purpose will be allowed rations for him from the 7th instant. That Colonel Roberts's regiment do mount a guard consisting of a sergeant and 12 privates on Gadsden's Wharf. One thing to keep in mind here is that the, quote, servants of the officers were sometimes white, but based on some of the lists in the Historical Society's collections, they were also sometimes enslaved men who were risking their lives for no pay and no chance at freedom. At this point in the order book, Lieutenant Colonel Owen Roberts is the head of the 4th Regiment, so let's talk a little bit about him. He was named the commandant of the regiment when it became official back in November of 1775, and he was married to Anne Fraser Cattle. He had a son, Richard Brooke Roberts, who also fought in the Revolution, and 2 years after taking command of the regiment, he was court-martialed, accused of not being at his post when the Marquis de Lafayette visited Fort Moultrie. But he was acquitted, and so he went on fighting until he was killed at the Battle of Stono Ferry in June 1779. According to the story, Lieutenant Colonel Roberts handed his sword to his son as he was dying, telling him to fight on. There is a painting of this event that is held by the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and we'll post that image on our social media so that you can see that. Okay, back to the order book. 5th January, Regimental Order, Parole Camden. Artillery officers hereafter are not to obey any orders that may be delivered them in an irregular and improper manner. General Orders, 9th January, 1776, Parole Hopkins. Ordered that the surgeons of the different South Carolina regiments do stop £5 from each man's pay, which he cures of a venereal disease. Ordered that Lieutenant Roberts do immediately relieve Lieutenant Ephraim Mitchell at Fort Johnson. That one is just delightful. I think it speaks to the idea of morality at the time because I'm sure that there were other diseases that were just as prevalent in a group of people living together in such close quarters at this time. But the venereal diseases are the ones that their soldiers are required to pay for by themselves. Regimental Orders, 11th January, Parole Devonshire. Lieutenant James and William Mitchell are to hold themselves in readiness to go recruiting. So, like in the last episode, we see an emphasis on recruiting still. The men would be assigned to go on these trips to areas outside of Charleston or even further, like the backcountry of South Carolina or even other states, to recruit men to come fight with them. In some of the lists of troops that are submitted by officers for the official record, these are called returns, it will state who the men were recruited by. And because these guys are leaving to go get more soldiers, there are some changes happening in who's in control at the various batteries around Charleston Harbor. And this is talked about in subsequent entries in the order book, but we'll go over them sort of quickly here. Villaponto is set to take charge of Hadrill's Point from James Mitchell, which is just across the harbor in Mount Pleasant. Captain Beckman is assigned Fort Johnson and the Western Battery, previously led by Lieutenant Roberts. Lieutenant Beckman gets the South Battery, and D'Atreville is assigned Beals Wharf. General Orders, 14th January, Parole Courage. Lieutenant Roberts and Mitchell are to take charge of the battery at Gadsden's Wharf until further orders. Should any enemy approach, they are to make the best defense in their power. We can see with this entry that they're really preparing, at least mentally, for a possible attack by the British. They know that the ships are out there, and perhaps they're getting intelligence that something is in the works. As we know now, British General Henry Clinton set sail in January toward North Carolina from Boston, and it's around this time that soldiers in the 1st and 2nd Regiments start building a temporary battery at Sullivan's Island until a permanent fort can be built, and that permanent fort gets used in just a few months. Preparation continues in the next entry, and it's one of my favorites because it details out their plans to extinguish a fire when an attack occurs, and they do say when in the entry. The entry does serve as a reminder, however, of the dispensability of the Black people who helped to serve the cause, many of whom would have been enslaved. General Orders, 15th January, Parole Unanimity. Ordered that when the town shall be attacked or alarmed, 1 subaltern, 1 sergeant, and 20 rank and file from Colonel Pinckney's regiment take post at the State House with one of the fire engines and a sufficient number of Negroes with fire hooks, axes, and ropes and ladders to observe. If any fire should break out in the town, immediately to repair to the place with the party and the engine and endeavor to extinguish the fire. 1 subaltern, 1 sergeant, and 20 rank and file from Colonel Pinckney's regiment, with 1 fire engine and Negroes sufficient to take post at Branford's Corner to observe and extinguish any fire. The order book goes on to list the numbers needed for other areas of the city besides that Branford's Corner you heard there, including Grimke's Corner, Ramage's Corner, and Colonel Bruton's Corner. The best part is the next, where the order book details how they use St. Michael's Church steeple as a signal to help those fighting the potential fires. If any fire should break out at night in town, some persons from the guard are to go up to the upper galley of St. Michael's Church steeple, and there hold out a lantern on a pole pointing towards the fire. Mr. Manigo and Mr. Thomas Smith to be one at the State House and the other at Ramage's Corner as directors to the engines, and to give such orders as they shall think necessary for extinguishing fires. The order book continues, assigning which regiments will be stationed at which batteries, and mentions that a guard should be posted at the barracks for the women and children who may be there. And then references the importance of keeping order books. Orders will be given out every morning at 11 o'clock in the State House. An officer or sergeant from each corps must attend to receive them. Colonel Moultrie recommends to all officers that they keep an orderly book and enter all orders that are issued, as it is frequently necessary to look back for orders many days past. General Orders, Parole, America. The commanding officer of the different corps to make a return as soon as possible to the commanding officer of the number of men they have now in Charlestown. Officers commanding at the different batteries are immediately to load all their guns with half charge of damaged powder for scaling at 12 o'clock. Granville's Bastion will begin the discharge and other batteries in turn will fire. Let the guns be particularly well wadded and rammed. All prisoners to be released. Lieutenant Beckman, officer of the day, who is to visit the guard at barracks twice a night. Lieutenant Detreville, officer of the day tomorrow. The batteries to be put in proper order immediately. Regimental Orders, 26 January 1776. Parole, Burke. Lieutenant Detreville, officer of the day tomorrow. Lieutenant Beckman is to take command of the artillery at Fort Johnson instead of Captain Beckman, now there, whose orders he will take a copy of and very strictly observe, this order to be executed tomorrow. The officer of the day may release from confinement all such prisoners as promise future good behavior. All officers having any accounts with their recruits are to settle them immediately. Some of the prisoners mentioned in there would have been South Carolinians who were loyalists. In fact, the South Carolinian Library at the University of South Carolina holds a petition to Henry Lawrence, who was president of the Council of Safety, which was the de facto state government at the time, dated just a few days before this entry. The petition is signed by several loyalists from the back country who were imprisoned in Charleston, asking to be released. And just as a quick reminder, the back country is sort of today's upstate, but even larger than that. It went a little bit further down. And that petition has been digitized, so you can view it on the website for the South Caroliniana Library. General Orders, Parole, Wilkes, 29th January. When the troops are served with salt pork, they are to be served with half a pint of rice per man, as an addition to their pork. A copy of this order to be sent to the contractor. The quartermasters are ordered to supply the troops with their allowance of vinegar at their different posts. Half a pint per week when in barracks or stated camps. 1 pint of salt per week when they are served with fresh provisions, and 1 pound of black pepper per year is to be had. Regimental Order, 1st February, Parole, Provincial Congress. Lieutenant Roberts, officer of the day tomorrow. Before the recruits of Captain White, Mr. Spencer, and Mr. Gilbank receive pay, the following oath must be tendered them by their respective commanding officer. I, A.B., do solemnly swear that I will faithfully, to the best of my knowledge and ability, serve the colony of South Carolina as a matras in the artillery regiment commanded by Colonel Roberts for the term of 2 years, if I may be required. As a quick note here, a matras was the term used for a soldier who assisted in loading, firing, and moving cannons. The officer of the day may release such prisoners from confinement as he thinks may merit such lenity. The 12-pounders laying before the barracks must be removed with their carriages to the battery. The officer of the day and Lieutenant Roberts will see the business done. Regimental After Orders. Should an alarm happen at any time in town, a subaltern officer, the first for duty with 20 men, are immediately to take post at Granville's Bastion, south end of the bay, and there do duty with the grenadiers of the 2nd Regiment until further orders. The remainder of the artillery regiment are to do duty at Lawrence's battery near their barracks. So these 2 entries begin a series of entries that give guidelines and orders regarding the appearance of the soldiers. And one thing that I want to point out here is that the men are required to get haircuts and wear certain things with their uniforms, and they're required to pay for them. The government does not provide these things for them, though they do force them to have them. General Order, Parole, Granby, 4th February. Captain White, officer of the day tomorrow. The commanding officers of companies are immediately to have their men's hair properly trimmed up and tied for cap wearing, but without side locks. For this purpose, they must hire barbers and pay them by stoppages. The adjutant must read, this forenoon to the regiment the articles against mutiny and desertion. 13th February, 1776. Regimental order. Parole, Newcastle. General order. On Saturday next will be delivered 100 suits of regimental clothing, wherefore it is expected by the Commandant that officers commanding companies will provide their men with the following necessaries immediately: shirts, shoes, stockings, and black leather stocks, for payment of which the men must have stoppages made out of their pay. This is done that the men may appear on Sunday next, like artillerymen, decent and uniform. 14 February. Parole, Boston. General orders by Colonel Gadsden that all recruiting officers of the provincial troops now in Georgia be immediately called out of the colony and that no more troops be recruited there or any of the South Carolina troops. So just in the month before this, in January, British ships had anchored off the coast of Georgia. So that state and the men there were expecting a British attack and preparing themselves accordingly. So this could be why the troops were ordered to no longer recruit men from our neighboring state. Regimental Order, 26 February, Parole, Fort Johnson. Lieutenant Vilponto, officer of the day tomorrow. All guards are to be paraded by 9 o'clock except on Sundays, when it must be done at 7 o'clock. The men of the different companies for guard are every day to be accompanied to the parade by their orderly corporal, who are to be answerable for anything amiss in their clothes, arms, or accoutrements, all of which the adjutant must examine minutely and punish every neglect. General orders by Colonel Gadsden that an orderly sergeant of the artillery attend Colonel Gadsden at his house every morning at 6 o'clock. If you, like me, were wondering what an orderly sergeant did, I found out. During this time, the orderly sergeant was the person who wrote everything in the order books, just like the one we're reading. He would then read the orders aloud to the men. So it's likely that the orderly sergeant was going to Colonel Gadsden's home every morning, where the colonel got to sleep in his own bed, which I imagine is quite the luxury during wartime. But he would go there to get the orders for the day and communicate them to the regiment. In these next few entries, they discuss imprisoning the family of a loyalist, John Stuart, orders which were handed down by Congress. Regimental Order, 28 February, Parole, Wilmington. Lieutenant Beckman, officer of the day tomorrow. The officer of the day and sergeant of the guard at barracks are to be particularly attentive to signals made at Fort Johnson or Sullivan's Island, and when any are discovered at either post, a sergeant must be immediately sent to inform Colonel Gadsden of the same. In Congress, 3 February 1776, resolved that it is expedient and necessary that the lady and daughter of John Stuart, Esquire, be restrained from absenting themselves from his house in Charleston. Ordered that proper guards be immediately placed and continued about the house of the said John Stuart to prevent such absenting, and that Colonel Moultrie do place guards accordingly. 5th February 1776. Resolved that Mr. Fenwick may have leave to take his wife into the country, he being answerable that she shall not depart the colony, and for her appearance at any time, agreeable to the order of Congress or the Council of Safety. Ordered that no person whatever be suffered to visit Mrs. Stuart without leave from Colonel Moultrie or the commanding officer for the time, being signified by an introduction, be an officer appointed by him for that purpose, and that if Miss Stuart shall at any time have occasion to go abroad with the permission of Colonel Moultrie or the commanding officer for the time being, she shall do so, attended by an officer to be appointed for that purpose. 17 February 1776. That Mrs. Stuart be allowed to take necessary air and exercise upon the terms proposed in Dr. Chalmers' letter, that is to be accompanied by Mr. Fenwick or the doctor, and they being responsible for her appearance whenever called for. The Stuarts, John and Sarah, lived in a house on Trad Street in downtown Charleston. Their house actually still exists today, and I may do a separate episode on them because they're really interesting. Under royal rule, John had been the king's superintendent for Indian affairs, and he was a loyalist, as we said before, and he was accused of gathering Native Americans to fight for the king during this time. By the time of this entry, he had escaped to Florida, where the British held power, and Sarah and her married daughter, Christiana Fenwick, were imprisoned in that Trad Street home. Eventually, Christiana was allowed to leave with her husband, Edward Fenwick, to his home on Johns Island, Fenwick Hall, because she was pregnant. And Sarah was eventually allowed to join her there, where they had a bit more freedom to roam. At some point, possibly when the British seized Charleston in 1780, Sarah also went to Florida, just like her husband, though it's unclear if she actually saw him before he died. Regimental General, 4th March, Parole, Ansonborough. Lieutenant Ephraim Mitchell, Officer of the Day tomorrow. Resolved in the Council of Safety the 6th January last that a reward of 20 pounds currency per man be paid by the public together with reasonable charges for taking up deserters from the colony regiments of foot, rangers, and artillery, and 10 pounds more for such as have deserted and carried off their arms, upon delivery of such deserters and deserters with their arms to their proper officer. General orders by Colonel Gadsden. Ordered that the commanding officers of regiments respectively do by publishing printed handbills throughout the colony offer the rewards above mentioned, and by other proper means endeavor to retake all deserters. Ordered that upon the firing of a cannon from the battery on Colonel Lawrence's wharf, the hoisting a jack or flag on top of the middle part of the barracks of the regiment of artillery at Gadsden's wharf, that all officers and others in Charlestown belonging to any of the provincial regiments immediately repair to their respective posts with all possible expedition. All right, it's the beginning of March, and the Provincial Army of South Carolina is attempting to get deserters back to increase their numbers, and the men are preparing for some fights. Just before this last entry, the Georgia troops do indeed fight a battle, the Battle of Yamacraw Bluff, which happened on the Savannah River at the border of Georgia and South Carolina. The British attacked several ships carrying rice, but the Georgia militia used a fire ship, literally a ship with explosives that they set on fire and let drift into the enemy's forces, which caught other ships on fire and forced the British to retreat. And in just a few weeks from now in the order book, South Carolina will have a shiny new constitution adopted into law. Thank you so much for joining us for this look into the past. Until our next episode, you can visit our museum in the Fireproof Building at 100 Meeting Street in Charleston, or our archives on the 3rd floor of College of Charleston's Addlestone Library. You can also visit our website at schistory.org or follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks so much for joining us.